Oliver Reynolds walked into the small cafe on a rainy afternoon, his expensive leather shoes clicking on the stone floor. The warm smell of coffee filled the air, mixing with the soft sound of classical music playing from an old piano in the corner. Oliver was known for his wealth, his sharp business mind, and his quick judgment of people. He liked to believe that money gave him the right to look down on others, to think he was better, smarter, and more important than most. The cafe was quiet, with only a few customers scattered around, reading newspapers or talking in low voices. In the corner, a young woman sat at the piano, her hands moving smoothly over the keys. She wasn't dressed in fancy clothes like some of the other customers. Instead, she wore a simple, worn-out sweater and jeans. She looked completely at ease, her focus on the music as it filled the room. Oliver's eyes narrowed. He didn't recognize her. She wasn't the kind of person who would catch his attention. But there was something about her, something that made him curious, if only for a moment. She was playing softly, almost as if the music was a private thing, just for her. He watched her for a few seconds, intrigued, but then shook his head. What could someone like her know about real music? He had seen enough of the world to know that most people only understood simple, easy things. As Oliver made his way to a table, he couldn't help but glance at the piano again. The woman, whose name he didn't know yet, had already finished one song and was starting another. Her fingers danced over the keys, moving with a quiet confidence that seemed out of place in a cafe like this. Oliver raised an eyebrow. It was impressive, but nothing special. It wasn't the kind of music people paid to hear. This was the kind of thing you heard in a high school recital, or maybe at a family gathering. Nothing about her performance stood out, and yet Oliver couldn't completely take his eyes off her. The cafe filled with the soft sound of the music, and Oliver made himself comfortable at a table near the window. He ordered a coffee, tapping his fingers impatiently on the table. He was used to being in control, used to people meeting his expectations. He didn't have time for anyone who didn't live up to those standards. And yet the music kept playing, a steady rhythmic sound that seemed to come from a place of deep focus. It was almost as if the woman was in her own world, not caring who was listening or watching. Oliver sipped his coffee slowly, his eyes flicking over the woman at the piano again. He had been right to judge her at first. It was just a quiet, simple tune, but he couldn't help but feel that something was off. Maybe it wasn't her music that was so intriguing. Maybe it was something about the way she carried herself, the calm that surrounded her in a world full of noise. There was more to this woman than he had first realized. The rain outside grew heavier, and the cafe became quieter, the perfect setting for the next part of this unexpected encounter. Oliver sat back in his chair, his fingers tapping the edge of his coffee cup as he watched Claire play. The soft sound of the piano was still in the background, but Oliver's thoughts began to shift. He had seen enough of this. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't anything remarkable either. The music was too gentle, too simple for his taste. Claire's performance, though impressive in its own way, didn't feel like the kind of thing that could hold the attention of a crowd for long. After a few more moments of watching her, Oliver's smirk grew. He had an idea. He liked to test people, push them just enough to see if they would rise to the occasion. He had done it countless times before, and it always worked. So why not try it with her? He stood up from his table and walked over to where Claire sat. Her hands were still moving gracefully over the keys, lost in the music. She didn't notice him approach at first. When he finally spoke, his voice was loud enough to draw the attention of a few nearby customers. "Do you only know how to play soft songs?" he asked, a challenge in his tone. Claire looked up at him, blinking in surprise. She didn't recognize him, of course. To her, he was just another customer. But to Oliver, she was a puzzle, and puzzles were meant to be solved. "I bet you can't play something difficult," he continued, his voice smooth. "Something that would impress people. I'm not sure you can handle it." Claire frowned, a hint of confusion crossing her face. She didn't quite understand why he was saying these things. He hadn't been listening to the music, had he? It wasn't about impressing people. It was about playing what she felt. But Oliver's words were sharper now, almost mocking. "I'm sure you only know the easy stuff, the kind of music that doesn't really mean anything." His words stung, but Claire didn't react. She just stayed still, her fingers resting on the piano keys, unsure of how to respond. Oliver crossed his arms and leaned against the side of the piano, his expression almost playful, but in a way that was meant to challenge her. "Come on," he said, his voice rising slightly. "Prove me wrong. Show me that you actually know something real." The cafe had quieted even more now, with a few people turning their attention toward the scene. Claire felt the eyes on her, but didn't look up. She was used to being underestimated, but there was something about the way Oliver spoke that made her hesitate for a second. It wasn't just his words, it was the tone, the way he seemed to think he had the right to judge her without really knowing anything about her. Claire took a deep breath. The music that challenged, the eyes of the cafe all seemed to melt away. She closed her eyes for just a moment, gathering her thoughts. Oliver watched, waiting for her to respond. But Claire didn't say a word. Instead, she simply placed her fingers back on the keys and began to play again, her hands moving with a quiet confidence that surprised even herself. But this time, it wasn't just a soft tune. Claire's fingers danced across the keys, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The sound of Claire's fingers hitting the piano keys seemed to fill the entire cafe. As the first few notes rang out, a sense of calm fell over the room. It was as if the air had shifted. Oliver, still standing near the piano, felt the change too, though he didn't immediately understand it. He had expected something shallow, something easy, but what he heard was different. Claire's hands moved confidently over the keys, her playing now strong and purposeful. The soft, quiet melody she had been playing before had transformed into something more complex, more intense. It was no longer a background noise, but a performance that demanded attention. Around the room, the other customers began to sit up straighter. A woman who had been reading her book lowered it slowly, her eyes wide. A man who had been sipping his coffee froze, his cup held halfway to his mouth. The sound of Claire's music was undeniable now. It wasn't just the notes that struck them, but the way she played. Each chord filled with meaning, with emotion that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Oliver frowned. He hadn't expected this. He was used to being the one who controlled situations, the one who made people feel small with a few words. But now, as Claire played, he felt something he rarely experienced: doubt. This wasn't the simple, unskilled performance he had been expecting. This wasn't the music of someone who didn't know what they were doing. No, this was something else. The cafe grew quieter with every note Claire played. Even the rain outside seemed to fall more softly, as if it too were listening. People had stopped talking altogether. The buzz of the cafe, the clatter of cups and plates, all faded into the background, replaced by the powerful sound of Claire's piano. It was as if the whole world had paused just to hear her. Oliver's arms, which had been crossed in a posture of superiority, dropped to his sides. He stared at her, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was something raw, something genuine in her playing that he hadn't expected. He couldn't ignore it anymore. He could see it in the way the other customers were looking at her, the way the music seemed to touch them. Even he felt the pull of it. Claire's fingers moved faster now, playing with a speed and precision that caught the attention of everyone in the room. The melody was building, the tension rising with each note. It wasn't loud or showy, but it had power. Her hands seemed to glide over the keys as if they were part of the piano itself, each movement deliberate, but filled with a quiet force that held the audience captive. Oliver shifted on his feet, unable to look away. He had challenged her, hoping to prove her wrong, to show her that she wasn't as good as she seemed. But now, as Claire's music continued to fill the space, he realized he was the one who had been wrong. The realization settled over him like a weight. When Claire finally came to the end of the piece, the last note ringing out gently into the quiet cafe, the room was completely still. There was a moment of silence before the first person clapped, then another. Soon the entire cafe was clapping, the sound warm and genuine. Claire, still seated at the piano, gave a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the applause, but she didn't smile. She didn't need to. Her music had already spoken for her. The last note of Claire's performance hung in the air for a few moments, a soft reminder of what had just happened. The cafe was still and quiet, as if no one wanted to break the spell. Oliver stood there, his arms by his sides, completely caught off guard. He hadn't expected her to play with such skill, such depth. In fact, he wasn't sure what he had expected at all. He had thought she would fall short, that she would play something simple and unremarkable. Instead, she had done the opposite. As Claire's fingers moved to rest on the keys, she seemed calm, almost unaffected by the wave of attention she had just drawn. Her gaze remained focused on the piano, her posture relaxed. To anyone else, it might seem like she hadn't noticed the audience, but Oliver couldn't help but think that perhaps it was exactly what she had wanted, to share her music, not for praise or recognition, but simply because it was part of who she was. The customers in the cafe were still applauding, their claps growing louder. Oliver glanced around the room, his mind racing. It was clear that the performance had left a lasting impact on everyone. The room that had once been full of casual chatter and quiet conversations was now alive with a sense of admiration and respect for the woman at the piano. "That was incredible," someone at the back of the cafe said, their voice breaking the silence. Others chimed in, their voices filled with amazement and appreciation. Oliver couldn't help but feel a strange sensation in his chest. It wasn't jealousy or frustration. It was something he hadn't felt in a long time: humility. Claire, still sitting at the piano, gave a small nod of acknowledgement to the room. She didn't speak, but there was a quiet grace in the way she accepted the applause. It was as if she didn't need anyone's approval, but at the same time, she appreciated it. Oliver found himself staring at her, his mind struggling to understand the situation. This was not the person he had expected her to be. For the first time in a long while, Oliver felt small. He had made the mistake of assuming that someone like Claire couldn't possibly have anything extraordinary to offer. He had judged her based on her appearance, based on his own ideas of what talent looked like. But now, as he stood there, he realized how wrong he had been. Claire's music wasn't about showing off or seeking attention. It was a reflection of who she was, of everything she had lived through, and everything she had to offer the world. The applause began to fade, but Oliver was still lost in thought. He had never been the type to admit when he was wrong. But now, standing in the quiet cafe with the echoes of Claire's music still in the air, he couldn't deny the truth. He had underestimated her in the worst possible way. As Claire slowly stood from the piano, the room slowly began to return to its usual rhythm. People went back to their conversations, their coffees, and their books, but Oliver remained standing, his eyes on her. For the first time, he wasn't just seeing her as a waitress or a background figure. He was seeing her as a person who had a story, a person who had more to offer than he had ever imagined. "You should be playing in a concert hall," he found himself saying, his voice soft, almost uncertain. Claire didn't reply at first, but when she did, her words were simple. "Maybe. But for now, this place is enough." The sound of Claire's music still lingered in the air, a soft reminder of what had just happened. The room had quieted down, but there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. People who had been lost in their own conversations moments before were now looking at Claire with a kind of quiet admiration. Some were nodding, others were whispering to each other, and a few had even gotten up to clap her on the back. But Claire, ever calm and composed, simply walked away from the piano as though nothing unusual had occurred. Oliver, still standing near the piano, couldn't stop staring at her. He had never experienced anything like this before. For a moment, he thought that maybe he was the only one who hadn't fully understood what had just taken place. Claire had played, and the entire cafe had listened. She hadn't needed to prove anything. She just played. And somehow, that had been enough to leave everyone in awe. As Claire made her way back to the counter to help with the drinks, the cafe felt a little quieter. The usual hum of conversation had slowed down, replaced by the faint echoes of the piano. Oliver stood there, unsure of what to do next. He had come here expecting a quick, easy encounter. He had expected to make a joke, challenge someone, and maybe even have a laugh. But now he was faced with a reality that didn't fit his usual way of thinking. He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of the other customers. They were still talking, but there was a different energy in the air. It wasn't the loud, bustling chatter that had filled the cafe before. It was quieter, more thoughtful, as if everyone was still processing the performance they had just witnessed. Oliver hadn't meant for things to go this way. He had only wanted to show how easy it was to mock someone like Claire. But now he felt something he hadn't expected: respect. He glanced back at the piano, and for the first time, he noticed the simple beauty of the instrument. It wasn't a grand piano, the kind you'd see in a concert hall. It was an old, weathered piece that had likely seen better days. But Claire had made it sing, and in doing so, she had turned the whole cafe into an audience. "Who is she?" someone whispered behind him. Oliver didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure if he even knew the answer. He had judged her too quickly, too harshly, based on nothing but her appearance and his assumptions. He had underestimated her, and now he realized how foolish that had been. Claire wasn't just a waitress or a background character in this cafe. She was someone who had something to say, and the piano was her way of saying it. As the conversation around him picked up again, Oliver sat down at his table, feeling oddly out of place. The applause for Claire had died down, but the feeling in the room hadn't quite left. Oliver took a sip of his coffee, the taste almost bitter in his mouth. He had been so certain that he knew everything. He had believed that money and status gave him the right to judge, to dictate what was valuable. But now he realized that there were things in this world that couldn't be measured by wealth or appearances. Claire, at the counter now, smiled at a few regular customers who had complimented her. She didn't seek attention or recognition, and that's what made her different. And Oliver, sitting silently, understood that he had just witnessed something far more important than any performance he'd ever seen. The cafe had settled back into its usual rhythm, the quiet chatter of customers mixing with the soft clinking of cups and plates. But for Oliver, nothing felt normal anymore. His mind was still on Claire and the performance she had given. As the minutes passed, he tried to shake off the feeling that had settled in him, but it wouldn't go away. There was something about her that he couldn't quite figure out. Claire had returned to her work behind the counter, moving with a quiet ease as she prepared drinks for the customers. She didn't seem bothered by the attention she had received, nor did she seem to care that Oliver was still watching her. To him, it was as if she was completely indifferent to everything happening around her, and that made her seem even more impressive. There was no arrogance, no need to prove anything. She simply played, and that had been enough to change everything. Oliver took a deep breath, trying to refocus on the moment. He was used to being the center of attention, used to having people listen to him, admire him. But with Claire, everything had shifted. He hadn't meant to challenge her in such a way, but somehow, she had shown him something he didn't expect: humility, honesty, and a kind of quiet power that couldn't be ignored. As the minutes passed, Oliver realized he had to say something. He had to acknowledge what had just happened, and maybe, just maybe, apologize for his earlier words. He stood up from his table and walked slowly toward the counter. Claire was still busy, making a coffee for another customer. She looked up briefly as he approached, but didn't stop what she was doing. "Hey," Oliver said, his voice unsure but genuine. Claire glanced at him, waiting for him to continue. "I just wanted to say something about earlier." Claire raised an eyebrow, not sure what to expect. Oliver wasn't sure himself what he was going to say, but he felt compelled to speak out. "I was wrong," he said, his voice quieter now. "About what I said. About you. I thought you were just some random person playing a simple tune. But I see now I was wrong." He paused, unsure of how to finish. He wasn't used to admitting his mistakes, but there was something about Claire that made him feel like he needed to. Claire looked at him for a long moment, and for a second, Oliver thought she might say something sarcastic or dismissive, but instead she simply nodded. "It's okay," she said quietly, as if she had expected nothing else. "I don't play for people like you. I play because I want to." Oliver stood there, a bit stunned by her response. He had expected something more, perhaps an apology or some sign of weakness, but Claire's words had none of that. They were simple, but they carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. She didn't need his approval, and that was exactly what made her so different from everyone else he knew. "I get it now," Oliver said slowly, realizing just how much he had underestimated her. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had learned something valuable. It wasn't about money or status or proving anything to anyone. It was about being true to yourself, no matter what. As he turned to walk back to his table, Oliver felt a sense of peace settle over him. Claire had reminded him of something important, something he had forgotten along the way. In that moment, he knew he would never forget the lesson he had learned today. The next few days at the cafe seemed to pass by slowly for Oliver. The moment with Claire had stayed with him longer than he expected. He kept replaying the conversation in his mind, her words echoing in his thoughts. "I don't play for people like you. I play because I want to." Those words felt heavier with each passing hour, and they made him think about his own life in a way he hadn't before. Oliver had always been used to people trying to impress him, to prove their worth. He had built his life around wealth and status, and he had expected others to do the same. But Claire, with her quiet confidence and her unassuming way of playing the piano, had turned everything he thought he knew upside down. He had walked into that cafe thinking he could mock her, and instead he had found someone who didn't need anyone's approval to be great. Every time Oliver walked into the cafe after that day, he found himself watching Claire more closely. She wasn't flashy or attention-seeking, but there was something in the way she moved, the way she carried herself, that made her stand out. She didn't need to prove anything, and yet there was a quiet power in her presence that no one could ignore. And for the first time, Oliver understood why. It wasn't just her music, though that was certainly a big part of it. It was how she approached life with a kind of simple honesty that Oliver had never really known. She didn't play to impress others, didn't care about recognition. She played because it was something she loved, something that made her feel connected to the world around her. And that was the part that had left Oliver questioning everything. One afternoon, after Claire had finished another beautiful performance on the piano, Oliver found himself walking up to the counter again. This time he wasn't sure what he would say, but he knew he had to say something. He stood there for a moment, watching her carefully as she worked. Claire looked up, as if sensing his presence, and gave him a small, knowing smile. "Hey," Oliver said, feeling a little awkward. "I've been thinking about what you said, about playing because you want to." Claire didn't say anything right away, but her eyes softened slightly, as if she understood exactly where he was coming from. She set down the coffee cup she was holding and looked at him. "It's true," she said simply. "I play because it's what makes me happy. I don't play for applause or for anyone's approval." Oliver nodded slowly, taking in her words. He had always thought that success was about being noticed, being admired. But Claire had shown him that sometimes the truest form of success was doing something simply because it mattered to you. No crowd, no applause, no recognition, just doing something because it was part of who you were. "I get it now," Oliver said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I think I've been chasing the wrong things for a long time." Claire smiled again, her expression warm but not expectant. She didn't need to hear him say it, but something in her eyes showed that she appreciated his honesty. "It's never too late to change," she said softly, her voice steady. "Sometimes you just have to look at things from a different angle." As Oliver walked back to his table, he felt lighter than he had in days. Claire had given him more than just a lesson in music. She had shown him a way to live that was true and free of the constant need for approval. And for the first time in a long time, Oliver felt like he was starting to see things more clearly. The days following Oliver's realization felt different. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and he was seeing the world with a new sense of clarity. He found himself thinking more carefully about his choices, about the way he viewed other people. No longer was he quick to judge or assume that what mattered most was wealth or status. Claire had shown him that there was more to life than what could be measured by money or appearances. Every time he returned to the cafe, he noticed more things. The way Claire moved around the space with ease, offering a smile or a kind word to the regular customers, and the way people seemed to respond to her. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. Instead, she made them feel like they mattered, and that was something far more powerful than anything he had ever learned to do. One afternoon, as Oliver sat at his usual table, sipping his coffee and watching Claire serve drinks, he found himself thinking about the future. He had spent so many years focused on building his career, making the right connections, and winning approval from the people around him. He had never stopped to think about what truly made him happy, what made him feel alive. It had always been about what he could gain, what he could achieve. But Claire's example had opened his eyes to something new, the possibility of doing something for its own sake, without the need for validation. As the sun began to set and the cafe started to quiet down, Oliver stood up and walked over to the piano. Claire was cleaning the counter, but when she noticed him approaching, she paused and looked up. Oliver wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he had to speak. "You were right," he began, his voice steady. "About everything. About playing for yourself, not for others." Claire raised an eyebrow, her expression calm but intrigued. She didn't say anything right away, but Oliver could see that she was listening. "I'd spent so much of my life trying to prove myself, trying to get ahead, but I've never really asked myself what I want to do. I don't think I've ever done something just for the sake of doing it." He paused, unsure if he was making any sense. "But I think I want to start." Claire smiled, her eyes softening. "It's not always easy," she said, "but it's worth it. Finding something that makes you feel like you're being true to yourself, it's a different kind of freedom." Oliver nodded, feeling a quiet understanding settle inside him. It was like a new path had opened before him, one that wasn't about pleasing others or chasing external rewards. It was about finding joy in something simple, something real. As Claire returned to her work, Oliver sat down at the piano. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, feeling the smooth surface beneath his touch. He wasn't sure if he would ever play like Claire, but for the first time, it didn't matter. He was doing it for himself, just as she had taught him. The sound of the keys filled the room, and though it was just a few scattered notes, Oliver felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. In that moment, he understood what Claire had been trying to show him all along. It wasn't about the applause, the recognition, or the validation. It was about doing something because it felt right, because it was part of who you were. And as he played, he smiled to himself, knowing that he was finally beginning to understand.